Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about consent, specifically in the realm of sexual interactions. So, what is consent? In Australia, consent is defined as the free and voluntary agreement to participate in sexual activity. In the UK, it's defined as agreed by choice by someone who has the freedom and capacity to make that choice. In the research world, Berez is someone who's focused on consent in the world of the BDSM community. She adds, consent is free from coercion, force, or undue influence. So the major themes throughout these three definitions are free, chosen, voluntary by someone who has the freedom, capacity to make those decisions, free from force or undue influence. Now, this word consent, though it is most often used in the realm of sexual interactions, that word sex goes beyond simply sexual intercourse to include the vast array of interactions that occur between two human beings when navigating romantic, sexual, physical, emotional, sensual, interactions, as well as many of the things that we're going to talk about, many of the lessons offered on this topic of consent really can apply to the theme of boundaries in any relationship. And as we go through this lecture today, I've taken a lot of inspiration from the BDSM community as they have really put a lot of attention and time into considering what consent means, how to practice it, and how to conduct safe, mutually beneficial sexual interactions. So here we go. Why is consent important? Well, consent in the world of mental health and in the world of sexual health often acts as a marker point between consensual sexual interaction and what is defined as sexual violence. In the DSM, consent is used to distinguish between pathological and non-pathological sexual behaviors. So from the view of the DSM, a lot of a lot of sexual behaviors mm, from the view of the DSM, harm to oneself or othered is defined by whether the activity is consensual or not. So consent plays a really major role in defining what harmful sex, if you will, hurtful sex looks like versus mutually beneficial and pleasurable. Sex acts as that dividing point. So today we're going to discuss why yes means yes and no means no is let's say, a simplistic or reductionist view of consent and why we need to go beyond this core teaching. We'll talk about the socio-historical context of consent, and we'll take a new look at how we can approach consent, inspired by lessons from the BDSM community. So, what you will learn by the end of today's lecture is you will understand why consent goes beyond simply yes means yes and no means no. You'll understand how socio-historical factors shape consent, and you'll gain a new look at how consent operates or can operate within intimate interactions. So, beyond yes means yes and no means no. What is this term that I keep referring to? Yes means yes and no means no. It's a teaching that has been used readily. I'm sorry, I'm trying to move this little box, my little box, so you can see the title, but I guess that's not working, so that's okay. So yes means yes and no means no are teachings that have been used in sexual education in many high schools throughout the US, with a very clear message of if someone says no, they mean no, and there's no sort of hidden undertone. There's value in the clarity and simplicity of this teaching, and as we'll touch on later in the socio-historical context of consent, there's reason for why this teaching exists. However, it is simplistic and a bit reductionist in its view. Now, why do I say that? Because in the world we often say no when we mean yes, and we often say yes when we mean no. And consent is often negotiated in many more layers than simply the explicit verbal expression. Consent is often negotiated through nonverbal interactions like silence, pace of speech, eye contact, proximity. Consent is often communicated through a giggle, a hair flick, a smile, or a distancing, a disengagement, perhaps even some cold or harsh affect. Now, what about other areas in which yes doesn't mean yes and no doesn't mean no? So again, to take inspiration from the BDSM community, there's a concept called consensual non-consent. Samantha finds it hot to have her consent violated by the right person. In the BDSM community, they have what's called no safe word sessions, in which affirmative assent to engage in activity that he or she will not be able to stop in the middle. It can be thought of as consenting to an activity in such a way that the consent may not be revoked. So essentially what I'm offering here is just other situations in which, in these situations, has been agreed beforehand that no does not mean no in this situation. No means yes. Now, I know that's getting into some tricky territory, but just to there again see that there are exceptions to this rule of yes always means yes. Samantha finds it hot to have her consent violated by the right person. We do have social narratives at this time in the world in which assertiveness, for men, or forwardness is often seen as attractive, or even women. And it needs to be considered that that sense of assertiveness can be part of a consensually safe sexual interaction. And it is not only that we always need the verbal, explicit yes. There's nuance. So we'll come back to that a little later on. But first, let's go into the socio-historical context of consent. Why are we even talking about consent? Why is it so important at this time that we're in? And what are the factors that have shaped consent up till now? So, the normalization of violence towards women. Historically, in colonized countries, men had legal power over and responsibility for their wives, to the extent that they could imprison or beat their wives without punishment or without them receiving any repercussions, any legal punishment. At those times, women lacked many rights. They weren't allowed to vote, they couldn't work, they couldn't own property. And still till today, in many countries in the world, men are still view women as their property. And that is quite prevalent throughout the world. An example here is in the Middle East, male guardianship gives men authority over women's lives, including their work decisions, their local, their domestic, their international travel, to the point that men can report women as absent from their homes, resulting in arrest, detention, or being forced to return to their homes. So here we have a historical norm in which women's right to consensual interactions has been revoked. And this clearly informs why consent is such an important and prevalent topic at this time, because many of these norms are still in the underpinnings of our social culture. Even in colonized, westernized countries, many of these historical nuances still shape how we interact with each other today. So now, gender roles. Consent is often assumed based on socialized gender norms. In sort of the dating realm or everyday relationships, consent is often overlooked. It's not always discussed. We have a social narrative of how relationships are meant to go, of how dating functions, and is often assumed by one party or the other how the other person may act, or so how the night may go. So let's look into gender roles a little more deeply here. Through the lens of stereotypical gender roles, women are often associated with passivity, nurturing, and accommodation. A woman's role is seen as to take care of her husband and her children's needs first before her own. Men are told to be viewed as strong, powerful, dominant, care caregivers in the sense that they must provide food, shelter, money, financial resources. They must keep their home safe. Men have been taught that they're supposed to pursue sex and that they should remain in control during sexual interactions. And this all plays into their strength, their power as human beings, as individuals. And it can be seen as weak to relinquish that power to another. Men have also been taught that women say no before saying yes. They've been taught, and women's sexuality has been shamed to the point that if women show the same amount of desire or frequency of sexual interaction as men, they are deemed as sluts. They are judged and stigmatized. So here we have so many social norms, messaging that influences the way that we act. So men have been taught perhaps often that women will say no before saying yes, that women need to be pursued and convinced. And furthermore, women have even been taught that they cannot be as overtly enthusiastic about sexual interactions. So here again, these these roles, these messages cloud how consent operates in the modern world. Yes. And not to put blame, not to put blame on either gender, um, just to begin to illuminate the forces that influence us today. So, are only women impacted by sexual violence and consent violations? No, absolutely not. About 1 in 4 men in the US have reported experiencing a form of contact sexual violence in their lifetime. 43% of men reported experiencing a form of sexual harassment or assault. And intimate partner violence is prevalent, very prevalent in same-sex relationships, with the statistic here showing that 43% of women who identify as lesbians reported experiencing intimate partner violence in their lifetime, and 26% of homosexual men. So the issue of consent violations goes well beyond just impacting women. However, as we look at social context, perhaps we can understand a bit better how violence in general and the revoking of one's rights runs deep throughout society's infrastructure and fabric, to the point where, of course, as it would come into the bedroom, come into the aspects of life that are more hidden and less talked about. So a new look at consent. Let's have a look at what consent could look like moving forward in intimate interactions. Inspired by the BDSM's community's deep dive into this topic. So, the word consent comes from the French word consentir, con meaning together or with, and sentir meaning to feel, offering us a richer, deeper definition, if you will, of a coming together to feel. Just another way we can look at this word, a coming together to feel. So, the BDSM community offers us levels of consent. First, they talk about surface level consent, the explicit verbal yes means yes, I want to interact with you, no means no, I don't want to interact with you. Next, they have what's called scene consent. They discuss before going into a play situation with a new partner, they will discuss what will happen in this encounter, what safe words will be used. We can see these as boundaries, whether there will or won't be affirmative consent, or whether they will agree upon consensual non-consent activities. So now I want to take this this theme outside of the BDSM community and parallel it and show the parallels within sort of more mainstream intimate interactions. So with someone you may be dating, you have the explicit, yes, I want to go on a date with you. No, I don't. There's a negotiation that happens before the scene, beforehand, of what are we going to do on this encounter. There may or may not be some boundaries that are created beforehand. Those boundaries may be expressed during the date, or perhaps before going to the partner's home. Boundaries may or may not be overtly discussed, but could be. And then comes, and then whether or not there will be a discussion on consent. So there's a discussion beforehand of how this is going to go and how this may play out. There may be some definition of, are we going to have boundaries? Are we not? What are those? What are they not? And then we have deep consent. So deep consent looks at what really happens when two people go into a scene together. What boundaries are violated, what boundaries are not. How do the individuals really feel when they're there? Are they able to do what they agreed upon doing? Do they feel a change? Are they able to go further than they thought they could? Or perhaps they're not. And then we also find out whether those boundaries or the consent will be violated or not. So we have surface level consent, explicit, often verbal, expressed. We have the sort of premeditated consent discussed beforehand, and then we have deeper levels of consent that occur within the interaction. Now, this brings us into risk and trust. Consent is underpinned by a negotiation between risk and trust. When it comes to dating someone new or agreeing to go into a sexual interaction with someone, there involves risk. How much do we really know this person? How much are we willing to agree to or accept? And there is some level of risk required when we go into that new interaction. Risk requires an element of trust. And trust is a way to accept riskiness. As the two or multiple individuals get to know each other, they're able to build trust. And perhaps even they're then able to invite more risk into the picture. Within the BDSM community, there's something called edge work, a testing of limits of that negotiation. Often this is agreed upon beforehand or once trust has been built within a partnership. A testing of limits of that negotiation, a pushing of boundaries of what has been agreed upon without breaching the limits. What does that mean? I have an example here to go into it a little deeper. So within the bondage, dominance, sadism, masochism community, individuals often take on roles. So we have individuals who may choose to be, in this example, we have a dominant partner and a submissive partner. So, apologies, let me have some more water here. So in this example, here, let's just read it together. The dominant partner's responsibility to attune to and notice their submissive partner's consent cues. As a dominant, you should be able to read the person's body language and you should know when it's too much for them because that shows you're attentive and responding to the other person. You're in a mutual situation. The submissive partner's responsibility is to attune to and verbalize their own limits. And the thing is with submission, you may be submitting, but you can't necessarily just let things happen and hope to God the other person you're playing with notices. That's why you need to be able to safe word. It's taking responsibility for your own emotions, your own responsive. So this theme of edge work, if we go back, a testing of limits of that negotiation, the pushing of boundaries of what has been agreed upon without breaching the limits. So earlier I touched a little bit on what a no safe word scene in the BDSM community can look like. So essentially, two individuals can go into an interaction, or again, multiple individuals can go into an interaction with each other where they, prior to the scene, decide that they're not going to use safe words within that interaction. And or trust between partners may be so deep that safe words essentially become no longer necessary. And this trust is built upon, I think it's very beautiful, honestly, an attunement, a mutual caring, a mutual responsibility towards one's own experience, their own emotions, their own responses that may be expected or unexpected, and to the partner, to the other person's body language, nonverbal cues, their responses, their emotions. So the two individuals coming together to notice each other to the point where they have built so much love, care, mutual support, and trust that they are able to put boundaries in for each other, say from the dominant partner's side, before the other person has to even verbalize it. They're just able to notice. And the submissive partner holds the same responsibility to take care of their needs. Now, as I've spoken of prior, because of the normalized social messaging and undertones of our social fabric at this time, we don't always have this mutual caring, respect, and responsibility between partners. In those moments, the individual isn't always able, they don't have the freedom or privilege to be fully responsible to take care of their own needs. They just don't. However, in this situation, it's just an example of how it could be. A mutual sharing, a mutual support, love, concern, attunement, attention to each other's safety at such a deep level of consent, where we're able to read each other's body language and nonverbal cues. So, all in all, consent is a gray area. Consent goes beyond the explicit utterance alone. It goes beyond yes means yes and no means no. Consent can be seen as a flow of implicit, explicit, intersubjective negotiation. Consent has many layers: surface, seen, and deep consent. Consent in its higher forms can be a shared responsibility with mutual care, love, and support. And underpinning all of this, why is consent so important? Why are we even discussing it? Because we have normalized violence towards particularly women, but also many minority cultures. And also towards other human beings in general, towards so many species, animals, towards our planet. We have normalized violence in our culture. We have normalized revoking people's freedom and rights. And we have prioritized power and dominance over others. And our gender norms perpetuate dominance, power plays, and sadly, sexual violence. So as we move forward, perhaps we could begin to create a more mutually loving, supportive, attuned way of interacting with each other, in which the other person's safety, well-being, desires, comfort is as vital as important as our own, versus just trying to get our needs met and satisfied. And I don't want to stand on a high horse or a pedestal here, because I know that I'm not perfect with all of these. I come from the same social fabric, from the same oppression, from the same privilege as many of those that we're having this discussion with right now. So, to close, what did you take away from today's lecture? What did you learn? Some questions to reflect on for yourself. How do socio-historical factors shape consent today? Why does consent go beyond yes means yes and no means no? Consent is a flow of implicit, explicit, intersubjective negotiation. How would you describe this definition of consent in your own words? A fill in the blanks. Consent is a negotiation of, and hint, it's a few slides prior to this, and I will provide the slides. And finally, in the BDSM community, who is responsible for giving and revoking consent? And perhaps just a little reminder and piece to add here. In the moments where sexual violence has occurred, there are so many moments where those individuals didn't have the privilege of revoking their consent. Some references from where all this information has come from. And finally, my contact details if you would like to get in touch. Thank you so much for your time, your attention. I hope you took something away from this presentation, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you.